Every Sunday, I drive my 97-year-old mother to visit a monster. She calls him Father. I call him the man who hollowed me out and left a ghost in my place. For 60 years, his secret has been a stone in my throat, a silence that has defined my entire life. But secrets, like bodies, don't stay buried forever. And the plan I set in motion decades ago is finally reaching its end. If you want to witness the unraveling of a dynasty built on lies, and see how a quiet old woman can bring down an empire, then follow my story. Like, share, and comment to join the conversation, and be sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single moment of the reckoning that is to come. My name is Nora, and I am 78 years old. The drive to Maple Creek Meadows is a familiar purgatory, a 20-minute journey through winding country roads that feel like a tightening knot. My mother, Eleanor, sits in the passenger seat. At 97, she has shrunk, her body a delicate collection of bird-like bones, but her will remains a rod of unbending iron. Her insistence on these weekly visits is the unassailable law of our quiet, lonely house. It is a commandment etched in stone, and I, her dutiful daughter, have always obeyed. "Drive a little faster, Nora," she says, her voice a reedy whisper that still carries the sharp edge of command. "We don't want to be late. Father will be waiting." I don't answer. The knuckles on my hands are white as I grip the steering wheel. He is always waiting. That is the point. We are going to visit my grandfather, Arthur Blackwood. He is 103, a local legend, the man who, according to my mother, carved Maple Creek out of the wilderness with his bare hands and sheer force of will. To me, he is something else entirely. The air inside Maple Creek Meadows always smells the same. A cloying blend of lavender-scented disinfectant, overboiled vegetables, and the faint, sweet odor of decay. It's a smell that clings to your clothes, to your hair, a scent I imagine I can never fully wash away. We walk down the polished linoleum corridor, my mother's walker squeaking a mournful rhythm against the floor. Nurses nod at us with practiced, professional sympathy. "Good afternoon, Eleanor." "Nora." "He's had a quiet morning." They say it every week. His room is at the end of the hall. Private, of course. The Blackwood name still buys certain privileges, even here, at the edge of life. The room is sterile, beige, punctuated only by a single, wilting bouquet of carnations my mother brought last Sunday. And in the center of the room, there he is, Arthur. He lies in the mechanical bed, a withered husk of the formidable man he once was. A massive stroke years ago stole his voice, his movement, his dominion. He is a king imprisoned within his own crumbling castle of flesh. He cannot speak. He cannot gesture. He cannot even turn his head. But his eyes are still there, pale blue, filmed over with age, but alive, and they follow me. From the moment I step through the door, they lock onto me, and they do not let go. They know me. They remember. My mother doesn't seem to notice. Or she chooses not to. She glides over to his bedside, a lifetime of devotion animating her fragile frame. "Father," she coos, her voice suddenly warm, syrupy. She takes his limp, waxy hand, the one with the prominent blue veins, and pats it rhythmically. "It's Eleanor, and Nora's here too. We've come to see you." I don't approach the bed. I take my designated seat by the window, a hard-backed chair that forces my spine into a rigid posture. From my bag, I retrieve my knitting, 2 long wooden needles and a ball of charcoal gray yarn. The rhythmic click-clack of the needles is the only sound I allow myself to contribute to the room's suffocating atmosphere. It is my shield, my metronome. Click, clack, the sound of time passing, of a debt coming due. Eleanor chatters on, filling the silence with a relentless stream of trivialities. The weather, the gossip from her bridge club, a complaint about the rising price of postage stamps. She speaks to him as if he is merely resting, as if he might at any moment sit up and offer one of his booming opinions. She is performing a play for an audience of one, and she forces me to be a part of the cast. To be here, in this room, with my monster, as if my weekly presence is a penance, an apology for some unspoken sin she has assigned to me. As if my being here validates her lifetime of willful blindness. She pauses her monologue and turns to me, her expression sharp. "Nora, Aren't you going to say hello to your grandfather? The needles stop. Click. I look from my hands to the man in the bed. His eyes are wide, fixed on me. Is that fear I see in them? Or is it just the vacant stare of a mind lost in the fog? I can never be sure. Hello, grandfather, I say, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. It is a line I have rehearsed 1,000 times. Satisfied, Eleanor turns back to him. She's so quiet, father. Always has been. Not like Richard. Oh, you would be so proud of Richard. His youngest just got accepted into law school. A Blackwood through and through. I resume my knitting. Click. Clack. My mother doesn't know what she is looking at. She sees a dutiful daughter, a quiet spinster tending to her knitting. She doesn't see the truth. She doesn't know that every stitch I make is a memory. Every loop of this dark gray yarn is a word I was never allowed to speak, a scream I swallowed, a tear I shed in a dark, silent room. Eleanor thinks I am making a scarf, perhaps, or a blanket. She has no idea that I am weaving a shroud, and it is almost finished. The smell of the lavender disinfectant is so strong today, it almost burns my nostrils. It's a clean smell, an artificial smell, meant to cover up the messiness of life and death. It reminds me of my mother, of the way she spent her life polishing the family name until it gleamed, a brilliant, blinding facade that hid the rot spreading beneath. The lavender scent pulls at a thread in my memory, and suddenly, I am no longer in this sterile room. The cloying chemical sweetness dissolves, replaced by the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. I am 15 again, and the world is painted in the vibrant, oversaturated colors of a bygone summer. I remember Maple Creek back then, in the years that felt like a sun-drenched forever. It wasn't just a town, it was a kingdom, and our family, the Blackwoods, wore the invisible crown. People spoke our name with a particular kind of reverence. We lived in the large white house on the hill, the one with the wraparound porch and the perfectly manicured gardens that my mother tended, with a ferocious devotion. From that porch, you could look down on the whole of Maple Creek, on the lives and the businesses that, in one way or another, owed their existence to my grandfather. Arthur Blackwood was not a man. He was a monument. He was the patriarch, the titan, the sun around which our entire universe revolved. He had a booming laugh that could fill any room, and a smile that could, as the townsfolk were fond of saying, charm a bird right out of a tree. His word was not just law, it was gospel. He built this town, people would say, their voices tinged with awe. He brought the mill. He paved the roads. He funded the library. He was a creator, a benefactor, a god in a tweed jacket. My mother, Eleanor, was his most devout disciple. She lived to serve his legacy, to protect his name. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being Arthur Blackwood's daughter. She polished the family silver until you could see your reflection, just as she polished every story, every anecdote about him, burnishing away any inconvenient edges until only a flawless, gleaming myth remained. She was the high priestess of the Blackwood cult, and her chief duty was to ensure the world saw only the perfection she curated. My father, in contrast, was a whisper in our house, a gentle but ineffectual man who had long since faded into the floral wallpaper, overwhelmed by the gravitational pull of his wife's family. He existed only in the periphery, a ghost at his own dinner table. The family was an ecosystem designed for two alpha predators, Arthur and his chosen heir, my older brother, Richard. Richard was everything I wasn't: loud, confident, athletic. He moved through the world with an unshakable sense of entitlement, basking in the golden light of our grandfather's favor. He was a true Blackwood. It was just me, Richard, my mother, and the colossal looming presence of Arthur. I was 15, a quiet girl who found more companionship in the pages of a book than in the company of others. I lived in a world of words and imagination, a safe harbor from the confusing, unspoken currents that ran through our home. I saw the way people in town looked at us, at the car we drove, at the clothes we wore. Their faces held a complicated mixture of admiration and envy. They saw the beautiful house, the respected name, the veneer of perfect American prosperity. They didn't see the truth. They couldn't see the bars of the gilded cage. They didn't understand that the manicured lawns felt like a perimeter fence, that the heavy oak door of our house was not a gateway, but a seal. I felt like a character in one of my novels, a princess trapped in a tower, only my tower was a grand colonial house, and the dragon was the man everyone called a saint. The abuse didn't begin with a roar. It began with a whisper. It wasn't a sudden, violent storm, but a slow, creeping fog that rolled in so gradually I didn't realize I was suffocating until I could no longer see the sun. It started with secrets, special privileges that set me apart, that made me feel chosen. "Let's not tell your mother," he'd say with a conspiratorial wink. "This will be our little secret." The secrets started as special trips into town, just him and me in his big, cavernous Buick. He'd buy me an ice cream soda at the diner, and his hand would rest on my knee as I sipped it through a straw, his thumb stroking the fabric of my skirt in small, rhythmic circles. It was a touch that lingered just a second too long, that felt too warm, that sent a confusing jolt of alarm through my body. But he was my grandfather, the town hero, and he was smiling at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. How could anything be wrong? He started calling me his special girl, his favorite. He would say it in a low voice when my mother or brother were just out of earshot. "You understand things, Nora. Not like the others. You have an old soul." The words were like little candies, sweet and intoxicating, and they made me feel important. But they also felt like weights, tying me to him, separating me from everyone else. He was building my prison brick by brick, using praise and affection as the mortar. And I, a lonely, bookish girl, was so starved for individual attention that I didn't even realize I was being walled in. Then the secrets moved from the public space of the diner to the private world of our property. The barn was his sanctuary. It stood at the far end of the property, a massive red structure that smelled perpetually of sweet hay, aging wood, and dry, dusty earth. For the other children in town, it was a place of adventure, a place for games of hide and seek. For him, it was a workshop, a place of quiet solitude. For me, it became my hell. The smell of hay and old wood is still a trigger. Even now, decades later, a whiff of it on a warm autumn day can send a cold dread coiling in my stomach. He would find reasons for us to be there alone, a tool he needed me to fetch, a loose board he needed me to hold in place. At first it was just his presence, the way the vast, empty space seemed to shrink when he closed the heavy door, plunging the interior into a dim, dusty twilight, lit only by the slivers of sun coming through the cracks in the walls. He would tell me about his life, about his struggles, painting himself as a misunderstood giant. He was creating a narrative of intimacy, of shared confidence. Then the touches became bolder, a hand that strayed from my shoulder to the small of my back, fingers that would brush against my chest by accident. He was a patient fisherman, slowly, skillfully reeling me in. And then, one hot, suffocating afternoon, the game changed. He told me it was our most important secret, a special game that proved how much I truly loved my family, a game that showed I was mature enough, special enough, to carry the weight of his trust. He used my love for my family as a weapon against me. He twisted my sense of duty into a shackle. He told me if I ever told anyone, ever, I would be the one to destroy everything. His voice, usually so full of booming confidence, became a chilling, venomous whisper in the dusty silence of that barn. "You will ruin this family, Nora," he hissed, his face so close to mine I could smell the coffee on his breath. "You will break your mother's heart. She would never survive the shame. Richard's future, everything I've built for him, it would all turn to ash. They'd call you a liar, a dirty, troubled girl, a whore. Your mother, she would never look at you again. She would hate you. Is that what you want? To be the one who burns it all to the ground?" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face, mixing with the dust on my cheeks. I was 15, and he was my grandfather, and he was telling me that the price of the truth was the destruction of my entire world. I believed him. And the most terrible part, the part that has haunted me for 63 years, is that he was right. He was right about my mother. The silence he imposed on me was a living thing. It had weight and texture. It sat on my chest at night, making it hard to breathe. It filled my ears during family dinners, turning the sound of their laughter into a dull, distant roar. For weeks, I lived inside that silence, a ghost haunting the hallways of my own home. I became jumpy, skittish. I stopped eating. I would wake up from nightmares, the smell of hay still in my nostrils, my own silent scream trapped in my throat. The bruises on my soul were invisible, but the ones on my body were starting to show. Faint marks on my arms where he'd gripped me too tightly, a darkening shadow on my leg. I was a terrible keeper of his secret, my own body a traitor, threatening to betray me. The fear of his threats was immense, but the crushing weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. I felt like a bottle filled with poison, and the pressure was building. I knew I was going to shatter. One afternoon, I decided I would risk it. I would risk destroying everything, because I felt I was already destroyed. I had to tell her. I had to believe that my mother's love for me would be stronger than her devotion to him. It was a foolish, desperate hope, the last flickering ember of the child I used to be. I found her in the kitchen. The room was bright, filled with afternoon sunlight that glinted off the polished copper pots hanging from the ceiling. She was arranging flowers in a crystal vase, a weekly ritual. White roses. She was snipping the stems with meticulous, almost surgical precision, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scene was so tranquil, so perfectly domestic, it felt like a painting, a beautiful lie. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard, I thought she must be able to hear it. My hands were shaking. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, trying to force the words out of my throat, which felt like it was full of sand. "Mother?" My voice was a thin, trembling whisper. She didn't turn around. She held a rose up to the light, inspecting it for imperfections. "What is it, Nora?" "I'm busy." I took a shaky breath. I need to tell you something." "Well, out with it. Don't just stand there hovering." I walked into the kitchen, my feet feeling like lead. I stopped a few feet behind her. The clean, slightly peppery scent of the roses filled the air. "It's about grandfather." At the mention of his name, she paused. She set the rose down on the marble countertop with exquisite care. Still, she did not turn to face me. "What about him?" she asked, her voice tight. This was it. The precipice. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Grandfather. He does things to me, Mother. In the barn. He hurts me." The words came out in a choked, desperate rush, tumbling over each other, ugly and raw in the sunlit kitchen. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It felt like the world had stopped spinning. Then, I heard a sharp, metallic snip. She had picked up her shears again. She snipped the stem of another white rose, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. She didn't drop the vase. She didn't gasp. She didn't even turn around. Her back remained ramrod straight. When she finally spoke, her voice was colder than any winter wind. It was a blade of ice. "Don't you ever, she said, her words spaced, deliberate and lethally sharp, say such a wicked, disgusting thing again. She turned then, slowly. Her face was a mask of fury and contempt. There was no concern in her eyes, no shock, no compassion, only disgust. "Do you have any idea what a man like your grandfather has done for this family, for this town? He is a great man, a good man, and you stand there in my kitchen and spew this filth." I tried to speak, to explain, but my voice was gone. A sob was building in my chest, a physical pain. She took a step toward me, her eyes boring into mine. "You will ruin us. Do you understand me? You will ruin this family with your filthy imagination. I will not have it. I will not have some hysterical, ungrateful child tear down everything your grandfather has built. You are to never speak of this again. Not to me, not to anyone. It did not happen. It is a lie you invented in that sick little head of yours." That was the moment. That was the precise second the daughter she knew died. The girl who believed in a mother's love, who hoped for protection, simply vanished. In her place, something else was born, something hard and cold and silent. I looked at the woman in front of me, the woman who gave me life, and I saw a stranger who had just chosen a monster over her own child. I didn't cry. The tears froze inside me. I just stared at her, absorbing the final, brutal lesson. I learned the family's first, last, and only commandment. Thou shalt keep the secrets of Arthur Blackwood. I nodded, a single jerky movement. And without another word, I turned and walked out of the sun-filled kitchen, leaving the scent of white roses and betrayal behind me. I walked back into the silence, but this time it was my own. It was a silence I would nurture, a silence that would one day become my greatest weapon. When I was 16, the predictable rhythm of my own body fell silent. A month passed, then another. The world didn't just tilt. It felt as though the ground beneath my feet had turned to water. I was adrift in a sea of pure, cold terror. It was a physical thing, this fear, a stone of ice that had taken up residence in my stomach, chilling me from the inside out. I tried to bargain with a God I wasn't sure I believed in, promising anything, everything, if the familiar cramps would just return. I drank bitter teas. I ran until my lungs burned, hoping to shock my system back into its known order. Nothing. My mother, Eleanor, noticed my pallor, the way I pushed food around my plate. "You look peaked, Nora," she'd say, her voice crisp and dismissive. "Stop moping. It's unbecoming." She saw illness, perhaps a touch of teenage melancholy. She saw nothing else because she refused to. Seeing would require an acknowledgement of things she had long ago locked away in the deepest vault of her mind. But Arthur knew. He always knew. He saw it before I had even allowed the full, horrifying word to form in my own thoughts. I was coming down the main staircase one afternoon, my hand trailing on the polished banister, when he came out of his study. He didn't look at my face. His eyes, still sharp and predatory even in his advancing age, dropped to my abdomen. He looked for a long moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. When his gaze finally met mine, his expression was a grotesque symphony of emotions I couldn't fully untangle then, but which I understand perfectly now. There was a flicker of something like surprise, quickly replaced by a chilling, possessive pride, and underneath it all, a look of profound, absolute triumph. He had marked his territory. He had branded me. He smiled, a thin, knowing curl of his lips, and nodded once, a gesture that said, "I know, and you are mine." He was the one who confirmed it, not with a question, but with a statement. He cornered me in the hallway a few days later, his bulk blocking my path. "We will have to make arrangements," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not you. We'll have to. We." In that single word, he claimed ownership, not just of my body, but of the child it carried. The child that was the product of his violence. I was pregnant. And just like that, the cold stone of terror in my stomach shattered, and the jagged pieces tore through me. The well-oiled Blackwood family machine, a mechanism built for the express purpose of maintaining appearances, whirred into motion with a chilling, silent efficiency. There were no raised voices, no panicked discussions, no tears. There was only a series of cold, strategic maneuvers. My mother summoned me to the parlor, the room reserved for important and usually unpleasant family business. She sat bolt upright in her wing-back chair, her hands clasped in her lap, a porcelain soldier. Arthur stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, the very picture of a concerned patriarch. "Nora," my mother began, her voice devoid of any warmth, "your grandfather has informed me of your condition." She said the word condition as if it were something foul she had found on the sole of her shoe. "You have been careless. You have brought shame upon this family." I stared at her, my mind reeling. Careless? Was that what this was? A moment of teenage folly? My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream, to point at the man by the fireplace and shriek the truth until the windows rattled. But the lesson of the barn, the lesson of my mother's denial, was seared into my soul. The first rule of the Blackwood family was to protect Arthur. The only rule. "There is a sick aunt," Eleanor continued, her eyes fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "Your great-aunt Mildred in Vermont. You will go to stay with her, to help care for her. That is what the neighbors will be told. That is what you will write in your letters." My brother, Richard, who was 17 and knew the universe revolved around him, was a silent accomplice. He had always been a boy of shadows and whispers, listening at keyholes, absorbing the family's secrets like a sponge. I saw him in the hallway sometimes, his eyes darting away the moment they met mine. He knew. I could see the knowledge in the tight set of his jaw, in the way he started giving my bedroom door a wide berth, as if my very presence was a contagion. He said nothing. To speak would be to risk his own comfortable position, his future, the Ivy League education Arthur had already promised him. He chose his inheritance over his sister. The choice was easy. The trip to what they called St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls was not a trip to Vermont, and there was no Aunt Mildred. It was a 100-mile drive in the opposite direction, to a gray, grim building squatting on a treeless patch of land. My mother drove. We didn't speak a single word the entire way. The silence in the car was thick, suffocating, punctuated only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. When we arrived, she didn't get out. She handed a nun, a woman with a face like granite, a thick envelope. Money. The price of my disappearance. "Behave yourself, Nora," she said, not looking at me. "Learn your lesson." Then she drove away, leaving me on the gravel path with a single suitcase and the ruin of my life. St. Jude's was a place where color and hope went to die. The walls were a pale, sickly green. The air smelled of disinfectant and despair. We were the wayward girls, a flock of shame-faced teenagers with swelling bellies, all of us paying the price for sins that were often not our own. We were stripped of our names and called by saints' names, a cruel irony. I was Agnes. We scrubbed floors, laundered sheets, and prayed for forgiveness in a cold chapel, our whispered confessions swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. My son was born on a raw, bitter morning in November. The sky was the color of lead, and a wind that felt like it was blowing straight from the Arctic rattled the window panes. The labor was long and brutal, a lonely agony in a sterile white room. But when it was over, and they placed him in my arms, the world fell away. He was so small, so perfect. He had a dusting of dark hair, and his father's. No, not his father's. He had my nose. He had my hands, tiny, wrinkled fists that clutched at my finger. For 10 minutes, I was not a sinner or a shameful secret. I was a mother. I memorized every line of his face, the feel of his weight against my chest, the soft, milky scent of his skin. I held a universe in my arms. Then the granite-faced nun returned. "Time's up, Agnes." She didn't say it unkindly, just as a statement of fact. She took him from my arms. I didn't fight. I didn't have the strength. I just watched as she walked out of the room, taking my heart, my son, my world with her. I never saw him again. A week later, a different nun, a younger one with a hint of pity in her eyes, handed me a form to sign. Adoption papers. Relinquishment of all rights. "It's for the best," she said softly. "He'll have a good life, with a real family." When my mother came to collect me, I was thinner, paler, a hollowed-out version of the girl who had left. She surveyed me with a critical eye. "Well," she said, her voice brisk, "that's dealt with. I trust you've learned the price of sin, Nora. Now, we will never speak of this again." And we never did. The silence she demanded was not an absence of sound. It was a weapon, a wall, a tomb. I returned to Maple Creek a ghost. I walked the familiar halls of my own home, but I was an intruder, a specter at a feast that was no longer for me. The family, my mother and Richard and Arthur when he visited, moved around me with a careful, practiced ignorance. They pretended nothing had happened. They spoke of the weather, of Richard's college applications, of town gossip, their voices flowing over and around the vast, silent chasm of my experience. That silence was a living entity in the house. It was louder than any scream, heavier than any stone. It sat with us at the dinner table. It filled the empty spaces in conversation, a constant, suffocating reminder of the secret we were all keeping. Richard, my golden boy brother, was accepted into an Ivy League college. There was a celebration. My mother baked his favorite cake. Arthur presented him with a ridiculously expensive leather-bound briefcase and a check that would cover his tuition for all 4 years. "For my brilliant grandson," Arthur had boomed, clapping Richard on the shoulder. "Make the Blackwood name proud." Richard beamed, his face alight with gratitude and ambition. He never looked at me. Why would he? I was part of the price of that briefcase, that elite education. His bright future was paid for by my silent suffering, funded by Arthur's generosity, a generosity that had a dark, unspoken source. While he went off to study economics and join fraternities, I remained at home. I was not a daughter anymore. I was a live-in servant, a creature of the shadows. I polished the silver that Richard would never use. I dusted the family portraits that no longer felt like they included me. I cooked the meals that were eaten in that crushing silence. My presence served a dual purpose for my mother and grandfather. I was a penance, a constant physical atonement for the shame I had brought them. And for Arthur, I was something more. I was a trophy, a constant, silent, living reminder of his absolute power, of the secrets he could command and the lives he could break without consequence. Years bled into one another, each one a muted gray copy of the last. I was a ship moored in a stagnant harbor, my sails rotted, my destination forgotten. Then, one day, the engine of our old sedan sputtered and died. My mother sent me to the local garage, and that's where I met Robert. He was the town mechanic, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands and a quiet kindness in his eyes. He wasn't handsome in the way the town considered it. He was just steady, like an old oak tree. He looked at my car, then he looked at me, and he saw something other people didn't. Most people in Maple Creek saw Nora Blackwood, the strange, quiet daughter from that prominent family. They saw the shell. Robert saw the cracks. He saw a deep, abiding sadness in me, a sorrow so profound it seemed to have settled into my bones, and he didn't run away. He didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. He just saw me. Our courtship was as quiet and unassuming as he was. He would leave a small, perfect wildflower on the windshield of my car after he'd worked on it. He'd talk to me about carburetors and spark plugs, but his eyes would be asking different questions, gentle questions about how I was, really. He was the first person in a decade to look at me without an agenda, without seeing a sin or a shame or a secret. He just saw Nora. We married a year later. It was a small ceremony at the Justice of the Peace. My mother approved of the match, but not for the reasons a mother should. She wasn't happy for me. She was relieved. Robert wasn't a Blackwood. He wasn't wealthy or influential, but he was respectable. And more importantly, my marrying him meant I would finally be out of her house. My spectral presence would no longer haunt her perfect, silent life. At the wedding, she gave me a brittle smile and a check for $100. "Don't be a stranger," she said, a meaningless pleasantry before turning her attention back to Richard. Robert and I built a life, a small, quiet, gentle life in a little house on the other side of town. He taught me how to laugh again, not loud, booming laughs, but small, breathy ones that felt like discovering a forgotten muscle. He held my hand when we walked down the street. He never pushed, never demanded more than I could give. But the trauma of my past was a high, invisible wall between us, a ghost in our marriage bed. We wanted children, or rather he did, and I wanted to want them for him, but my body remembered. It held the trauma in its very cells. We tried for years. We saw doctors who ran tests and offered theories. "There's no physical reason," one of them said, looking at a chart, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Everything seems to be in perfect working order." I knew better. It wasn't about my body's mechanics. It was about its memory. Every time Robert touched me with love and tenderness, a shadow of Arthur's violating hands would flicker in my mind. My body would remember the scratchy wool of the blanket, the cloying smell of hay and old wood, the terror and the powerlessness. My body remembered the barn, and it refused. It closed itself off, a fortress against the possibility of ever being that vulnerable again. I could never tell Robert the whole truth. It was a secret too monstrous to speak, a poison I couldn't bear to let touch the one good, clean thing in my life. He knew I carried a great sadness, a wound from my past, but he never knew its name or its face. And because of it, our home remained quiet, filled only with the two of us and the unspoken grief for the children we would never have. Robert died 2 years ago, a sudden heart attack while working under a pickup truck. One moment he was here, smelling of motor oil and quiet strength, and the next he was gone. The silence he left behind was different from the silence of my family home. It wasn't oppressive. It was just empty. A hollow space where his gentle presence used to be. For 2 years, I moved through that hollowness, a ghost once more, tending to the life we had built as if it were a museum. Last month, on a gray, drizzly Saturday, I finally found the strength to tackle the attic. It was a task I'd been putting off, a final frontier of our shared life that I hadn't been ready to face. The air upstairs was thick with the scent of dust and decades, a library of forgotten things. In the far corner, tucked under the eaves, was Robert's old military footlocker. He rarely spoke of his time in the army, but he'd kept this trunk through all our years together. I ran my hand over the rough, painted wood, my fingers tracing his stenciled name. With a sigh, I lifted the heavy lid. It groaned in protest. Inside, it was neatly packed. A few old uniforms, a handful of medals, some dog-eared paperbacks. I picked one up. It was his favorite, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. He must have read it a dozen times. As I thumbed through the familiar, yellowed pages, something slipped from between them and fluttered to the dusty floor. It was a small, faded photograph. I bent down, my knees creaking, and picked it up. My breath caught in my throat. The world seemed to stop spinning. It was a picture of a newborn baby, his face wrinkled and red, his body tiny and lost in a standard-issue hospital blanket. His eyes were squeezed shut against the newness of the world. I knew that face. I had stared at it for 10 minutes 62 years ago, searing it into my memory. It was my son. My hand trembled so violently I could barely turn the photograph over. On the back, in Robert's careful, neat handwriting, was a date. November 12th, 1961, my son's birthday. And beneath the date, a name and a phone number. Frank Miller, private investigator. I sank to the floor, the dusty floorboards cold against my legs. I clutched the tiny photograph to my chest as a wave of understanding, so powerful it was physically painful, crashed over me. My gentle, quiet Robert. My husband, who had respected my silence and never pushed for the secrets I couldn't share. He had known. He must have pieced together the fragments I'd let slip over the years, the sadness, the aversion to my family, the sick aunt story that never quite added up. And without ever telling me, without ever wanting to raise my hopes only to have them dashed, he had spent years, and who knows how much of our modest savings, trying to find him for me. He had been searching for my lost boy. He had been trying to heal the one wound I could never show him. The grief I felt in that moment was a physical blow, a great tearing sob that ripped through me, for my lost son, for my lost husband, for the silent, noble love he had shown me. I wept until there were no tears left, just dry, shuddering gasps in the dusty silence of the attic. But as the storm of sorrow began to subside, something else stirred deep within me. It started as a faint warmth in the cold ashes of my soul. A single, hot spark. It wasn't grief. It wasn't love. It was rage. Pure, incandescent rage. A rage that had been buried for 62 years under layers of shame, fear, and silence. In that dusty attic, holding the proof of my husband's love and the image of my stolen child, the ghost of Nora Blackwood died, and a warrior was born. The spark caught fire. The following Sunday, my ritual changed. The drive to the Golden Pines nursing home felt different. The dread was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overlaid with something else. Purpose. My hands didn't tremble on the steering wheel, they were steady. When I walked through the familiar antiseptic-scented hallways, my steps weren't hesitant. They were deliberate. I was no longer a daughter performing a hated duty. I was a hunter visiting a trap. I stopped seeing the frail, dying old man in the bed. I stopped seeing the pathetic husk of a human being trapped in a failing body. When I looked at Arthur Blackwood, I started seeing what he truly was, a cornered animal. The monster was still in there, behind the vacant eyes and the slack jaw. And for the first time, I felt a surge of power. He was the one who was helpless now. He was the one who was trapped. And I was the one holding the key. I sat in my usual chair beside his bed, pulling the yarn and knitting needles from my bag. The familiar click-clack filled the sterile silence of the room. But I began to talk. Not the usual small talk, the meaningless updates about the weather or the state of the garden. I began to tell him stories. "It's going to be a hot summer," I said, my voice calm and even, my eyes fixed on the gray wool weaving through my fingers. "It reminds me of the summer I turned 16, grandfather. Do you remember that summer? The heat was something fierce. The air in the barn was so thick you could barely breathe." I paused, listening. The rhythmic wheeze of his breathing hitched for a fraction of a second. A muscle in his sagging cheek, a place that hadn't moved in years, gave a tiny spastic twitch. He was in there. He could hear me. And he understood. A cold, thrilling certainty washed over me. I had found my weapon. It wasn't a knife or a poison. It was memory. My memory. The one thing he couldn't take from me. The one thing he had forced me to carry alone for all these years. Now, I would make him carry it with me. The next Sunday, I continued. "The wool blanket was so scratchy," I murmured, as if reminiscing about a fond picnic. "The red and black plaid one. It left marks on my skin. And the smell of the hay. It's funny, I can't smell fresh-cut grass anymore without feeling sick to my stomach. Isn't that strange?" His breathing grew ragged, a wet, rasping sound. His right hand, curled into a useless claw on the white sheet, tightened for a moment, the knuckles showing white, before falling slack again. Victory. Small, yes, but it was a start. The first crack in the facade. While I was waging my silent war against Arthur, I began a second, more subtle campaign. I started paying attention to the staff. Most were harried, overworked, moving through their shifts with a professional detachment. But there was one, a young nurse named Sarah, who was different. She had kind eyes and a gentle touch. She always took a moment to straighten Arthur's blanket or adjust his pillow, speaking to him as if he could answer back. She saw a person, not just a patient. I started talking to her. Not about anything important, at first. I was planting seeds, testing the soil. "You have a lovely way with him," I said to her one afternoon as she was checking his vitals. "Most people are in such a rush." She gave me a small, tired smile. "He deserves his dignity, same as anyone else. It must be hard on your family, seeing him like this." "It is," I said, letting a carefully calibrated note of weariness enter my voice. My mother finds it all very difficult. She's from a generation that doesn't handle illness well." "Appearance is everything to her." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I've met her. She seems very particular." "That's a polite way of putting it," I said with a small, conspiratorial laugh. "Eleanor Blackwood is a force of nature, always has been. The family reputation is more important to her than anything." I let the statement hang in the air, a small, baited hook. Over the next few weeks, I watered these seeds. I'd bring Sarah a cup of coffee. I'd ask about her studies. She was taking classes at night to become a nurse practitioner. I built a rapport, a foundation of simple human connection. Then I would drop another piece of the puzzle. "My brother Richard is supposed to share the visiting duties," I mentioned one day, feigning frustration, "but he's always too busy with his investments. It's always been that way. Richard gets the opportunities. I get the responsibilities. Grandfather's money made sure of that." I was careful. I never told her anything incriminating. I never mentioned the barn or the baby or the abuse. I was just a tired, dutiful daughter, caught between a formidable mother and a self-absorbed brother, caring for the dying patriarch who had funded their comfortable lives. I was painting a picture, one brushstroke at a time, of a dysfunctional family held together by money and secrets. I was looking for an ally. I didn't know exactly how I would use her yet, but I knew I couldn't tear down the House of Blackwood alone. I needed someone on the inside. And in Sarah's kind, compassionate eyes, I saw the faintest glimmer of a possibility. Sarah didn't just offer me a sympathetic ear. She offered me a weapon. A week after I first spoke her name, she gave me another one, Ben Carter. He was a friend of her brother's, a young lawyer whose office was 2 small rooms above a bakery. The air was perpetually scented with yeast and sugar, a cloying sweetness that was almost unbearable. He was all sharp angles and restless energy, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He worked pro bono cases, which is why Sarah suggested him. She thought I couldn't afford anyone else. She was wrong. Robert had left me more than comfortable, but I didn't want a lawyer who saw me as a client. I wanted one who saw a cause. I wanted someone hungry. "So, Mrs. Vance," he began, his pen tapping a rhythm on a yellow legal pad. "Sarah told me you were having some family difficulties regarding your grandfather's estate." I had rehearsed the story, stripping it of its flesh and blood, leaving only a clean, sterile skeleton. "My grandfather, Arthur Blackwood, controls the family," I said, my voice even. "He suffered a stroke some years ago and is nonverbal, but his influence, it persists. My brother, Richard, manages the family assets under his direction. I'm concerned about the arrangements. There has been a history of emotional manipulation, financial control." Ben nodded slowly. His tapping ceased. "Financial control. Can you give me an example?" "My entire life has been an example," I wanted to say. Instead, I gave him something tangible. My brother's education, his business ventures, they were all financed by my grandfather. I was provided for, but never given agency. My life has been one of dependence, structured to keep me quiet and in my place. I felt a pang of disgust at the word provided. It was the word one used for livestock. He wrote that down. "And you believe his will reflects this pattern of control?" "I believe his will is the final lock on the cage," I said. He looked up from his pad, and for a moment the professional veneer cracked. I saw a flicker of something else, not pity, but a keen, discerning intelligence. He knew there was more. The skeleton of my story had rattling bones, and he could hear them. But he didn't push. Not then. He just said, "Okay, Mrs. Vance. Let's start with the will. Getting a look at it while Mr. Blackwood is still alive will be tricky, but not impossible. I have a few ideas." The next few weeks were a strange dance of clandestine phone calls and discreetly passed envelopes. Ben was brilliant. He moved through the labyrinthine world of trusts and estate law like a phantom. He found a disgruntled former clerk in the county records office, a man Arthur had ruined over a minor land dispute 40 years ago. He found a loophole in the power of attorney Richard held. Slowly, piece by piece, he assembled the puzzle. The day he found it, he didn't call. He showed up at my door, a manila folder in his hand, his face grim. The smell of the bakery wasn't clinging to him today. He smelled of rain and cold determination. "I think you should sit down, Nora," he said, using my first name for the first time. I remained standing in the entryway of the small house Robert and I had shared. "Just tell me, Ben." He opened the folder on my hall table. The documents were dense with legal jargon, a forest of subclauses and codicils, but the meaning was clear, sharp, and cruel. It was, as I had suspected, a masterpiece of posthumous abuse, a testament to a tyrant's need to rule from beyond the grave. "It's all held in a single irrevocable trust," Ben explained, his finger tracing a line of text. "The Blackwood Family Legacy Trust. Your brother Richard is named the primary trustee." "Of course he is," I murmured. "But," Ben continued, "his trusteeship is conditional. He has to adhere to a set of brutally specific bylaws. He must maintain a residence in Maple Creek for at least 6 months of the year. He must submit to an annual financial and personal audit by a board controlled by Arthur's oldest business partners. And this," he tapped a paragraph, "is the linchpin. The trustee's primary duty is the preservation of the family's public standing and good name. Any action, public or private, which is deemed by the board to bring disrepute, scandal, or dishonor upon the Blackwood name will result in the immediate and permanent removal of the trustee and the forfeiture of all associated benefits." It was a leash, forged in gold, that would reach from Arthur's coffin and wrap itself around Richard's neck. He would be a king, but a king in a cage of his own. "What about my mother?" I asked, my voice hollow. Ben flipped a page. Eleanor is designated as a dependent beneficiary. She's to be granted a generous stipend for the remainder of her life, for her comfort and care. But the distribution of that stipend is entirely at the discretion of the trustee, Richard. So my mother's comfort was dependent on her son's goodwill, which was, in turn, dependent on his absolute obedience to his dead father's reputation. A perfect closed loop of control. "And me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I felt it in the cold marrow of my bones. Ben's eyes met mine. They were full of a quiet anger on my behalf. He turned to the last page, to a short, addendum-like clause at the very bottom. He didn't read it, he just pointed. My eyes found the line. "To my daughter, Nora Blackwood Vance, whose life has been a source of profound disappointment, I bequeath the sum of $1. $1. The ultimate dismissal. The final slap in the face. It wasn't about the money. I had never expected a penny of his blood-soaked fortune. It was about the statement. It was a message to the world, to history itself, that I was worthless. An afterthought, a rounding error in the grand ledger of the Blackwood dynasty. I looked up at Ben. The cool, calculated fury I had been nurturing for 60 years was now a white-hot star in my chest. This document wasn't a will. It was an epitaph Arthur was trying to write for me. But I was not dead yet. "Thank you, Ben," I said, my voice steady. "This is exactly what I needed. Now, I know what I have to do." The following Sunday felt different. The air was sharper, the autumn sun lower in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. As I walked toward the entrance of the nursing home, I didn't carry my knitting bag. The time for weaving threads, for patient, methodical work was over. Today was the day for cutting them. In the pocket of my coat, my hand was wrapped around a small, rectangular object, its edges softened by time. Robert's faded photograph of a child I never knew. Luck, or perhaps fate, was on my side. When I reached Arthur's room, the door was slightly ajar. I peeked inside. He was alone, a small mercy. I saw my mother through the window, sitting in the cafeteria with 2 other women, her laughter a brittle, tinkling sound that didn't reach her eyes. She was performing her role as the dutiful daughter for a different audience today. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled of antiseptic and regret. Arthur was slumped in his wheelchair by the window, a plaid blanket draped over his useless legs. His head was tilted to one side, a thin line of spittle tracing a path from the corner of his mouth. His eyes, those once commanding blue eyes, were foggy, distant, lost in the gray landscape of a broken mind. But I knew he was in there. I had seen the flickers of awareness, the ghosts of comprehension, during my Sunday readings. He was a prisoner in the collapsing castle of his own body. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings. This was it. The culmination of a lifetime of pain, the final move in a game that had been played in secret for decades. I walked over to him, my shoes silent on the linoleum floor. I didn't speak. Words were for the past. Today was for a different kind of truth. I knelt beside his wheelchair, bringing myself to his level. I reached out and took his hand. It was limp, the skin like dry parchment, crisscrossed with a map of blue veins. His flesh was cold, but I imagined I could feel the faint, malevolent heat deep within it. With my other hand, I retrieved the photograph from my pocket. It was small, creased, the black and white image muted to shades of gray. A tiny scrunched-up face, a tuft of dark hair, a small, clenched fist. My son. I carefully placed the photograph into his palm. His fingers didn't respond, so I folded them over it, one by one, forcing his hand to hold the evidence of his sin. His eyes shifted, a slow, cloudy turn from the window to my face. There was a flicker of confusion, nothing more. I leaned in close, so close my hair brushed against his withered cheek. The stale, sour scent of his breath washed over me. I brought my lips almost to his ear, the conspiratorial intimacy of it a bitter poison on my tongue. And then, I spoke the lie, the most terrible, beautiful lie I had ever conceived. My voice was not a shout. It was a whisper, as soft and deadly as falling snow. I found him, I breathed, the words a ghost in the quiet room. Our son. He's a man now, and he knows Arthur. He knows everything. I pulled back to watch his face. For a moment, nothing happened. The fog in his eyes remained. Then, something shifted. It started as a subtle tremor, a tiny spark deep behind the cloudy surface. The fog began to burn away. Comprehension dawned, not slowly, but like a flash of lightning, illuminating the ruin within. His eyes, for the first time in years, became perfectly, horribly clear, and in them, I saw it. Not anger, not confusion, but pure, abject terror. It was the terror of a monster who believed his crimes were buried, who thought his secrets would die with him, only to find them resurrected and standing at his door. The terror of a king whose final, most fortified castle, the silence of his victim, had just been breached. His eyes widened until the whites showed all around the faded blue irises. His mouth, that cruel thin line I knew so well, fell open. A sound tried to escape, a strangled, wet gasp, but it was trapped in his paralyzed throat. It was a silent scream. His body, which had been so still for so long, began to jerk. A violent, uncontrollable convulsion seized him. The wheelchair rattled against the window pane. The plaid blanket slipped to the floor. The photograph fell from his spasming hand and landed face up on the cold linoleum. His head thrashed back, and a low, guttural moan, the first sound I had heard him make in 5 years, filled the room. He had another stroke, right there in front of me. A final, catastrophic storm in the wasteland of his brain. I didn't move. I just watched. I watched the monster die. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and the frantic squeak of rubber-soled shoes. Nurses and doctors swarmed around Arthur's gurney like wasps on a fallen thing. I stood to one side, a small still point in the chaos, my hands tucked into my pockets. I felt nothing, not triumph, not remorse, just a vast, hollow emptiness. The silence after a bomb has gone off. My mother arrived, a whirlwind of manufactured grief and genuine panic. Her face was a mask of distress, her hair slightly askew. "Nora, what did you do?" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the sterile hallway. "He was fine this morning. You must have said something, you must have upset him." I just looked at her. Her accusations were like stones thrown into a bottomless well. They simply disappeared without a splash. My brother Richard flew in from Chicago a few hours later. He strode into the ICU waiting area like he owned it, radiating an aura of expensive cologne and false concern. He was 56, but he still had the entitled swagger of the boy who had always gotten everything he wanted. "Mother, I came as soon as I could," he said, enveloping her in a brief, awkward hug. He glanced at me, his eyes cold and suspicious. "Nora, what happened?" My mother started to weep, a theatrical display for her son's benefit. "It was her, Richard. She was alone with him. I knew something like this would happen. She's always resented him." It was there, under the relentless hum of the hospital lights, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and fear, that I finally detonated the weapon I had been building for 60 years. The time had come. I let them finish their performance. I waited until Richard had patted his mother's shoulder and turned his full, accusatory glare on me. "Well, Nora?" he demanded. "Are you going to say something? Or are you just going to stand there like a ghost?" "I was a ghost for a long time, Richard," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying in the tense silence. "You just never bothered to look." He scoffed. "Oh, here we go. 60 years of cryptic nonsense. Just tell us what happened." "I'll tell you what happened," I said, and I took a small step forward. "I'll tell you everything. Not just about today, about 1962, about the barn behind the big house." Richard's smirk faltered. My mother's weeping stopped abruptly. The air grew thick and heavy. "I'll tell you about how your father, our grandfather, used to visit me there," I continued, my gaze locked on Richard, but my words painting a scene for them both. "I'll tell you about the smell of hay and old wood and how he used my silence to his advantage. I'll tell you about the pregnancy." My mother let out a strangled gasp. "Nora, stop it. Not here." "Especially here," I said, my voice hardening. "I'll tell you about the baby, Richard. The son I had at 16, the one they took from me before I could even hold him, the one this family erased so the Blackwood name could remain clean." Richard stared at me, his face pale, his bravado crumbling. You're lying. You're a senile old woman, making up stories for attention. You're sick." "Am I?" I reached into my handbag and pulled out a thick envelope, the one Ben had given me. "You always liked facts, Richard. You were a businessman. So, let's talk business." I pulled out the first document and held it up. "This is a bank statement for a trust fund, the Maple Creek Education and Enterprise Fund. It was established by Arthur Blackwood in September of 1962. Does that year ring a bell? It was the year I was sent away to that home for troubled girls. Funny coincidence, isn't it?" I threw the paper onto the empty chair between us. "And this," I said, pulling out another, "is a ledger detailing every withdrawal from that fund. The tuition for your preparatory school, the seed money for your first failed business, the down payment on your first house, the funding for your MBA at Wharton. Your entire life, Richard. Every advantage you ever had, every door that was ever opened for you. It was all paid for with my silence. That wasn't grandfather's money. That was my hush money, funneled directly to you." Richard looked at the papers, then back at my face. The blood had drained from his. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by a frightened, bewildered boy. He was speechless, but my mother was not. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the papers, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that had nothing to do with my pain. She finally looked up, her face twisted not in sorrow for her daughter, but in a raw, naked fury. "You fool!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You foolish, selfish girl. You've ruined us! After everything we did, everything we sacrificed to protect you, to protect this family, the money. What about the money? You've destroyed everything." In that moment, hearing those words, something inside me that had been clenched tight for 62 years finally, blessedly, let go. She didn't cry for the daughter who was violated. She didn't mourn the grandson she never met. She screamed for the money, for the reputation, for the gilded cage. I looked at her, at this woman who had given me life and then stolen it from me, and I felt nothing but a vast, desolate peace. I was finally free of her. "The money is gone, Mother," I said calmly. "It was never really yours to begin with." Arthur Blackwood died 2 days later, without ever regaining consciousness. He slipped away in the quiet of the night, the machines beside his bed falling silent, one by one. I was not there. His death was a postscript to a story that had, for me, already ended. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. It was held in the offices of Blackwood, Finch, and Hayes, Arthur's law firm, for over 70 years. The room was just as I'd imagined, paneled in dark, suffocating mahogany, smelling of old paper and dust, with a large oil portrait of a stern-faced ancestor glaring down at us. Richard was there, looking diminished. The confident bluster was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful pallor. He sat in a high-backed leather chair as if it were a throne, but it was a throne on a crumbling mountain. My mother sat beside him, ramrod straight, her face a frozen mask of indignation. She refused to look at me. Mr. Hayes, a man nearly as old and dry as the documents he held, cleared his throat and began to read. The language was pompous and archaic, a long, rambling preamble about legacy and duty. I listened to the drone of his voice, the words washing over me. The trust was detailed, Richard's conditional power laid bare. My mother's discretionary stipend, and then the final dismissive clause. "And to my daughter, Nora Blackwood Vance," Mr. Hayes read, without a flicker of emotion. "I bequeath the sum of $1. Richard's lawyer, a slick man in a suit too sharp for the dusty room, allowed himself a small, smug smile. Richard straightened his shoulders, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. It was done. The final insult was delivered. The monster had had the last word, or so he thought. As Mr. Hayes folded the document, Ben stood up. He was a stark contrast to the rest of the room, young, vibrant, a splash of color in a monochrome world. "Mr. Hayes," Ben said, his voice clear and firm, "we are here to inform you, and all parties present, that my client, Mrs. Nora Vance, intends to contest the validity of this will." Richard's lawyer scoffed audibly. "On what grounds?" "The document is ironclad. Mr. Blackwood was of sound mind when it was drafted." "We will be contesting on the grounds of decades of sustained emotional abuse, coercion, and undue influence," Ben stated calmly. "We will argue that this will is not a testament of final wishes, but the culmination of a lifelong pattern of control and punishment, designed to silence a victim." The smug smile on the lawyer's face faltered. "That's a very serious and, frankly, slanderous accusation. You'll need more than the bitter ramblings of a disinherited daughter. You'll need proof. You'll need a witness." "I understand," Ben said. He didn't look at the stack of financial documents in his briefcase. He didn't look at me. He looked toward the heavy mahogany door at the back of the room. "Our main witness is here," he said simply. As if on cue, the door opened. Every head in the room turned. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, expecting, I don't know, what? A social worker from 60 years ago? A ghost? The man who walked in was in his late 50s. He was tall, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they were accustomed to hard work. His hair was gray at the temples, and his face was a landscape of quiet sorrow, etched with lines of a pain that I recognized instantly. It was a mirror of the pain I saw in my own face every morning. It wasn't my son. I knew in that instant that it could never have been my son. That was a wound that would not heal, a story without an ending. But this man was something else. He was a different kind of justice. In my search for my own history, in the papers Robert had left me, and the threads Ben had helped me pull, I had found other stories, faded newspaper clippings, whispers in town records, other girls who had suffered under the long shadow of Arthur Blackwood. One name stood out, Martha Riley, a girl who worked one summer at the Blackwood farm in 1958 and then simply vanished. Her family said she'd run off to the city. I knew better. I found her years later through a private investigator. She had died of cancer a decade ago in a small town in Oregon, but not before she told her own son the truth. The man stopped in the center of the room. He looked at Richard. He looked at my mother, whose face had gone a chalky white. The resemblance was faint, but it was there. A shadow of Martha Riley's smile, the same deep-set, knowing eyes. Richard's lawyer looked confused. "And who is this?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. The man didn't wait for Ben to introduce him. He spoke for himself, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a lifetime of borrowed grief. "My name is James Riley," he said. "My mother was Martha Riley." A choked sound came from my mother's throat. The name had struck a chord, a memory she had buried deep. James looked directly at her, and then at Richard, pinning them with his gaze. "She worked for your family one summer when she was 17. Then she left. You told everyone she ran away, but she told me everything before she died. Everything Arthur Blackwood did to her in that barn. I'm ready to talk." Silence. A profound, crushing silence filled the room. The mahogany walls seemed to press in, the air thick and unbreathable. Richard's face was a mask of disbelief and horror. My mother looked like she had seen a ghost, the ghost of a girl she had chosen to forget, now resurrected in the face of her son. The lie I had told Arthur had been a fiction, but the truth that had just walked through the door was real. It was solid. It was undeniable. It proved a pattern. It turned my story from a singular, private tragedy into a public crime. The final thread of the Blackwood tapestry had not just been pulled. It had been set on fire. The air in Ben's conference room was sterile, chilled to a temperature that was meant to keep suits from wrinkling and minds sharp. It felt like a morgue, a place where things were clinically concluded. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Richard and my mother, Eleanor. They looked smaller than I'd ever seen them, shrunken by the cavernous room and the weight of their imminent ruin. Richard's expensive suit, usually a suit of armor, hung on him like a borrowed costume. His face, normally ruddy with entitlement, was a blotchy, pale mask of disbelief. Eleanor was a study in petrified rage. She didn't look at me. She stared at a point on the far wall, her posture so rigid I thought she might shatter. Her silence was more damning than any scream. It was the same silence that had condemned me 60 years ago. On my side, there was only Ben and me. He was calm, his papers arranged in a neat, lethal stack. He had been my rock, the quiet, unassuming lawyer Sarah had introduced me to, who turned out to possess a spine of steel and a mind like a diamond drill. He had taken the tangled, rotten threads of my family's finances and woven them into a noose. Ben cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. "Let me be perfectly clear," he began, his voice even and devoid of triumph. He was a professional. "We have two paths forward. Path 1. We proceed to a public trial. The full complaint will be filed. It will include Nora's testimony, the testimony of Mr. James Albright regarding his late mother, and the extensive financial records we have uncovered. These records detail a systematic pattern of asset concealment and misappropriation directly linked to the events of 1963. Given the severity of the allegations and the corroborating evidence, it is almost certain that a criminal investigation would follow. The Blackwood name, as you know it, would cease to exist in any reputable sense. It would become a synonym for monstrousness." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison gas. Richard flinched. A muscle in his jaw jumped, a frantic, trapped thing. Mother remained motionless, a queen of ice on a melting throne. "Path 2, Ben continued, sliding a single, thick document across the table. "Is this settlement agreement? It is non-negotiable. The terms are simple. You will both sign over complete and irrevocable control of the entire Blackwood estate, including all trusts, properties, and liquid assets, to Nora. In return, a court-mandated stipend will be established for your living expenses. It is modest, enough to live, not enough to rule. You will vacate all Blackwood properties within 30 days. You will agree to a permanent injunction, preventing any contact with Nora. And this foundation of secrets, this empire of silence, will be dissolved quietly. No press, no public filings beyond the necessary transfers of title. Nora gets justice. You get to keep your liberty and whatever shreds of anonymity you can find." Silence. The air conditioning hummed. I watched my brother's face. I saw 60 years of unearned privilege curdling into panic. He had lived his entire life on a cushion of money he never questioned, a life funded by my torment. He finally turned his head and looked at me, his eyes pleading, confused, and furious all at once. "Nora, you can't do this," he whispered, his voice raspy. "This is our family, our legacy. Everything, Father. Everything Grandfather built." "He built it on me," I said, and my voice was a stranger's. It was low and steady, a tone forged in the cold fire of a nursing home room. It held none of my childhood fear, none of my adult resignation. It was simply the voice of the truth. "He built it on my stolen childhood, and you lived in it, Richard. You decorated the rooms with your happy life and never once asked what the foundations were made of." Eleanor's head snapped towards me. The Ice Queen finally cracked. "You ungrateful child," she hissed, her voice a venomous spray. "After everything we gave you, a roof over your head, you would destroy us for a fantasy, for a lie you invented to cover your own shame?" The words, once so powerful they could kill a part of me, were now just noise. They were the desperate rattling of a cage door long after the bird has flown. "Shame?" I met her gaze. For the first time, I didn't shrink. "The shame was never mine, Mother. The shame was yours. It was yours when you chose his reputation over your daughter's safety. It was yours when you sent me away to hide your problem. It was yours every single day for 60 years that you chose to believe the comfortable lie instead of the inconvenient truth. This isn't about my shame, it's about your bill. And it's finally come due." Richard slammed his palm on the table, a pathetic imitation of Arthur's old power. "There's nothing to prove. It's the word of a hysterical old woman and some other lunatic, against the memory of a great man." Ben leaned forward slightly. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood," he said softly, "it's the word of two credible witnesses against a mountain of financial evidence that shows a secret trust. The Maple Creek Discretionary Fund was established on the exact date Nora was sent away. A fund from which your education, your first car, the down payment on your house, and your business seed money were all drawn. A fund created to buy your prosperity and her silence. We can and will prove it." That was it. The final blow. The paper trail. The one language my family truly understood. Richard slumped back in his chair, defeated. The fight drained out of him, leaving a deflated, middle-aged man who had just discovered his whole life was a lie he had benefited from. Eleanor stared at the document on the table, her god, silence, and the paper that would enforce it. Her hand, trembling with age and fury, reached for the pen Ben offered. She didn't read the pages. She knew what they meant. The loss of the house, the loss of status, the loss of money. That was the only tragedy she could comprehend. Her signature was a vicious, angry slash of ink. Richard followed, his hand clumsy. He pushed the document back across the table as if it were contaminated. He wouldn't look at me. He couldn't. To look at me would be to acknowledge the price of his life. And then it was over. Just like that. Decades of pain, of planning, of waiting, concluded with 2 strokes of a pen in a cold room. There was no thunderous applause, no divine judgment, just the quiet, bureaucratic death of a dynasty. They stood to leave. My mother walked past me without a glance, her back a ramrod of denial. Richard paused, just for a second, his mouth opening as if to say something. But what was there to say? Sorry? Thank you? He just shook his head slightly and followed our mother out of the room, out of the building, out of my life. I watched them from the window as they got into a modest, unremarkable sedan, a car they likely now owned instead of the chauffeur-driven town cars of their past. They drove away, and the town they once held in their thrall didn't even seem to notice. They were just 2 old people, swallowed by the afternoon traffic, their empire reduced to a cloud of dust in their rearview mirror. Ben touched my arm gently. "It's done, Nora." I nodded, my gaze still fixed on the empty street. I didn't feel the elation I had imagined. I didn't feel the savage joy of victory. I felt quiet. The roaring furnace of rage that had kept me warm for so long had finally burned itself out. In its place was a vast, hollow emptiness. The thread was unraveled. The monster was gone. His enablers were vanquished, but the tapestry of my life was still in pieces at my feet. Now I had to decide what to do with the threads. The Blackwood estate was an obscenity of wealth. When Ben walked me through the portfolio, the numbers were meaningless, abstract figures on a page. Stocks, bonds, real estate holdings, offshore accounts that Arthur had thought were so cleverly hidden. It was a dragon's hoard, amassed through power and intimidation, and now it was mine. "You could buy a private island, Nora," Ben said, a week later, trying to inject some levity into the sterile atmosphere of his office. "Retire to somewhere warm. Never think about Maple Creek again." I looked at the ledger in front of me, at the entry for the Maple Creek Discretionary Fund, the one that had paid for Richard's life. The money felt dirty, radioactive. Every dollar was stained with my tears, with my silence. "I don't want it, Ben," I said, my voice firm. "Not for myself. It's blood money." He wasn't surprised. He had come to know me well over the past few months. He simply nodded, waiting. "What do you want to do with it?" The idea had been growing in the quiet space that the rage had left behind. It was a fragile seedling at first, but now, watered by this grotesque inheritance, it was taking root. "I want to build something," I said. "Something that grows out of the ashes. Arthur built an empire to hide his secrets. I want to use his money to build a place that brings secrets into the light." I explained it to him. A foundation. A legal aid service for people trapped in families like mine, people whose abusers were protected by money and reputation. A genealogical service to fund searches for children like my son. Children who were erased, taken away in the dead of night, to preserve a family's good name. A slow smile spread across Ben's face. That's a powerful idea, Nora. I have a name for it, I said, the word feeling perfect and inevitable on my tongue. The Phoenix Foundation. The legal work was immense, a mountain of paperwork that Ben navigated with meticulous care. While he turned the gears of the law, I turned my attention to a more immediate, more symbolic task. I used a sliver of the estate's funds to do the one thing I had dreamed of for years. I bought the old Blackwood property, the house where my mother had called me a liar, the sprawling grounds where Arthur had played the benevolent patriarch, and the barn. The real estate agent, a young man who couldn't hide his nervousness, walked me through the house. It was just as I remembered, only filled with Richard and his wife's things now. Tasteless, expensive furniture, gilded frames holding pictures of their smiling, perfect family. The air was thick with the ghosts of unspoken truths. I walked through the halls, my footsteps echoing. I didn't feel sadness or nostalgia. I felt like an exterminator surveying an infestation. I didn't linger. I walked out the back, across the manicured lawn, towards the barn. It stood there, weathered and gray, a silent monument to my private horror. The scent of old wood and dry hay, even after all these years, hit me like a physical blow. I could almost hear the rustle in the loft, feel the rough, splintery wall against my back. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. The nightmares had kept the interior perfectly preserved in my memory. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it, the structure that had housed the beginning of my end. The next day, I made a phone call. "Patterson Demolition," a gruff voice answered. "Hello," I said, my own voice steady. "I would like a quote for a demolition job. The old Blackwood property on the hill." There was a pause. "The whole thing, ma'am? The main house, too?" "Yes," I said. "Everything. The house, the outbuildings, and especially the barn. I want it all torn down to the foundation. I want the rubble hauled away. I want the ground scraped clean." "Yes, ma'am," the man said, his voice now purely professional. He'd probably torn down stranger things for stranger reasons. "We can do that." The day the crew arrived, I was there. I sat in my car, parked at the end of the long driveway, a safe distance away. It was a crisp autumn morning. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The crew moved with an efficient, impersonal rhythm, setting up their equipment, taping off the area. There was no ceremony. It was just a job. The first blow was to the house. The massive claw of an excavator bit into the roof of the sunroom, Richard's wife's favorite spot. Plaster and glass exploded outwards. The sound was a violent, liberating roar. Wall by wall, room by room, the house that had been my prison was reduced to a pile of splintered wood and broken bricks. I watched the dining room where I'd been forced to sit in silence, the staircase I'd crept down in fear, the front door my mother had closed behind me when she sent me away. I watched it all get pulverized into dust. Then, they turned to the barn. My breath caught in my throat. This was different. This was personal. The house had been a cage, but the barn was the altar where I had been sacrificed. The excavator approached it slowly, like a cautious beast. Its metal arm rose, poised. For a heart-stopping second, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. And then it struck. The claw tore through the old gray planks of the wall where he had pinned me. The sound was a deep, groaning crack, the cry of a dying monster. The roof, the one I had stared at, counting the rafters while I prayed for it all to end, collapsed inwards in a cloud of dust and ancient hay particles. It came down so fast. A lifetime of nightmares erased in less than a minute. I watched until there was nothing left but a jagged footprint of stone foundation and a mountain of shattered timber. I got out of my car and walked closer, the scent of churned earth and pulverized wood filling the air. The dust settled on my coat, on my hair. I didn't brush it off. I let it cover me. It was the dust of my past, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was watching it blow away on the wind. The roaring in my ears had stopped. The weight on my chest, the one I had carried for 60 years, had finally lifted. I was standing on cleared ground. The land lay fallow for a season, healing under a blanket of winter snow. The Phoenix Foundation was now a reality, operating out of a modest office downtown, with Ben at the head of its legal board. We had already taken on our first cases, providing counsel to a young woman whose father was a respected town official and funding a search for a man in his 50s who had just learned he was adopted. The money that had been used to enforce silence was now giving people a voice. But the plot of land on the hill remained my personal project. When spring came and the ground thawed, I didn't hire developers to build luxury condos. I hired a landscape architect, a young woman with kind eyes and hands smudged with soil. "What's your vision for the space?" she asked, as we stood on the bare earth where the house once stood. "Life," I said simply. "I want to bring life back to this place." We designed a public park for the main grounds, with walking trails and simple wooden benches. But for the small, square patch of land where the barn had been, I had a very specific plan. "A memorial garden," I told her, "but not a somber one. I want it to be resilient. I want plants that can survive a late frost, that don't need constant tending, things that are strong and quiet." We chose hardy perennials, lavender and sage, coneflowers, and black-eyed Susans. We planned a single, winding path of smooth river stones. At the center, not a statue or a fountain, but a single stone bench facing east towards the rising sun. There would be a small plaque, so discreet you might miss it if you weren't looking. It would not bear the Blackwood name. It would say only, "For the Forgotten Children." I didn't just supervise. I worked. I bought gardening gloves and a trowel. The first time I plunged my hands into the soil where the barn had stood, a tremor went through me. This was the same earth that had absorbed my silent screams. But it felt different now. It was just soil, cool and damp and full of promise. My knitting needles lay forgotten in a basket at home. My hands, which for years had been clenched around them, weaving my anger into a shroud, were now open, coaxing new life from the dirt. They were calm. The garden grew. The townspeople, at first curious and wary, began to visit. I'd see them walking the paths, or an elderly couple sitting on a bench. Sometimes, young mothers would bring their children, who would laugh and chase butterflies among the flowers. They didn't know the full story of what had happened on this land, and they didn't need to. They only knew that a place that was once a symbol of intimidating, private power was now open to everyone. It was a place of peace. I come here most afternoons. I don't think of myself as a victim anymore. I am not the silent girl in the starched dress, or the angry woman in the nursing home, a weaver of vengeance. I am the gardener. It is a quiet, powerful thing to be a gardener. You learn the cycles of decay and rebirth. You learn that from the most rotted, broken ground, something beautiful and strong can grow, if you are patient enough to tend it. I took the rot and ruin of my family, the compost of my pain, and I planted something new. James, the man whose testimony had been the final key, sometimes joins me on the bench. He is a quiet man, his own life a long, slow recovery from the damage Arthur had inflicted on his mother. We don't talk about the past. We don't mention the names of the men who haunt our histories. We talk about the weather. We talk about which flowers are thriving. We watch the bees move from blossom to blossom. In our shared silence, there is a profound understanding. We are the survivors. We are the gardeners. I never found my son. The foundation has helped others find their lost relatives, but the trail for my own child, born so long ago and whisked away into a system designed for erasure, went cold. For a while, that was a raw, open wound. But sitting here, in this garden, I have come to understand peace. Perhaps it is for the best. My son has lived a whole life without this poison, without the shadow of the Blackwood name. I hope his life has been happy. I hope he was loved. My revenge was never about finding him and showing him to Arthur. My revenge was not a single dramatic act. It was the slow, patient, deliberate act of tearing down a house of secrets and planting a garden in its place. My victory is in the legal aid we provide, in the families we reunite. It is in the fact that no man like Arthur Blackwood in this town will ever again believe he can hide in the shadows of his own power. The price of silence has been paid, but the currency is now hope. The thread that Arthur used to bind me, the one I spent a lifetime learning to unravel, is finally gone. It has been tilled back into the earth, and something better is growing in its place. And I, at last, am at peace. It's a strange thing to spend a lifetime consumed by a single story, only to find yourself at the end of it. My story is over, but so many others are just beginning. What part of your own life have you had to tear down to the foundations in order to plant something new? Let me know in the comments below.